Good morning and welcome to Virtual Village Hall. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Chris Jesson. And Chris Jesson is also known as Groovy Gardening UK. Now, Chris is a speaker, he's a writer, a blogger, a presenter, and a professional gardener, originally from Lincolnshire. He's also a career changer, leaving the world of town planning to train in horticulture. And Chris was one of the gardening team leaders at Autism East Midlands and is now the head gardener at Le Pommier Hotel in Guernsey, where he manages the hotel grounds, the gardens, and the horticultural programme. Chris is also a really passionate advocate for autistic gardeners and joins us today at Virtual Village Hall following up from the Autism Acceptance Month, which was last month. Beyond gardening as well, Chris is a dedicated advocate for autistic gardeners, using platforms such as social media, public speaking and writing to raise awareness and promote inclusion. And Chris's work has been recognised with several awards, and they continue to inspire others through their journey and contributions to gardening. So welcome, Chris. What a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Please, thank you for the introduction as well.
You're very welcome. So I've got a few questions for you today, Chris. And the first one from me today is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, apart from the introduction I've given you, and how you became interested in gardening?
Well, it's a long, convoluted story, but actually the gardening interest was relatively recent. I mean, you're talking only the past 5 years. Wow. Where this has started moving on. But the background to me is that, of course, I grew up in, or still am living in a world that's not fine-tuned necessarily for all aspects of how I'm necessarily wired up. And as a child, it was quite a challenge going through the educational system early on. But what was immediately noticeable, despite a lot of challenging behaviours being involved, is that there was a strong drive in, of course, special interest areas of things that I really liked doing. And I actually retrained to become a gardener from being a chartered town planner. And that was my ultimate special interest. And that cascades down from childhood, really, you know, looking out the window on drives out, basically memorising the world and the environment and the way people use spaces around me. And I used to draw a lot. I used to draw maps and of places, and often made up places and so forth. And that translated really well into a want to do something related to the world that we live in, and it led to a career in that. And that's what I thought I would do. And I did that successfully for a long, long time. I blossomed quite late, fortunate, thankfully, after, as mentioned about school life being a particular struggle. But I did have a lot of support. I was diagnosed with autism back in 1999. So I've had a lot of experience of trying to negotiate the hurdles of that. And have support at school, albeit it was quite difficult to obtain, like it still is these days. But I think there was that inherent enthusiasm, often a lot of struggle behaviourally and understanding people's kind of minds and emotions at the other end. But through all that, there was always a determination to set out what I wanted to do and enjoy what I wanted to do. And that got me through everything. It got me to determine to go through all the exams and pass those with the adequacy that I needed to get to do what I ended up doing. But actually, you know, I did that for 13 years, and then I've successfully, since lockdown, which was the trigger, got the bug for gardening. You know, we were forced outside and into our gardens. I had a new build house at the time, and I thought, oh, I'm enjoying doing this more than what I, in a way, or if not just as much at the time, with the same vigour for what I was doing before. And I didn't have any career ambition at the time, but I was starting to post a lot of pictures of plants and so forth online, and realising that not everybody would want to see those. And that's what motivated a separate media account to kind of document what the garden was doing, what I was doing, as we were both progressing together. And that's where Groovy Gardening was born. But actually, you know, I've only come to learn that gardening was something I inherited through that earlier profession, that understanding of the environment and place and space, and then looking at older family members who are long gone, in some cases, that have inspired me along that journey, realised how important it was, because I've got a photographic memory, and that's a real asset, and it's sort of like a sponge that takes all these things in that you don't necessarily realise that you're going to need later on in life.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I love the way that you talked about your relationship with your garden, because it really is a partnership, isn't it? You know,
Very much.
working with the garden, it really is a partnership. And I was really interested to hear you sort of referencing that.
Very,
So go on. No,
absolutely.
go on. Yeah. So talking a little bit more about gardening and autism in particular. So how do you feel that gardening has impacted on your life as an autistic person?
I mean, just looking here, these are locally grown Guernsey chrysanthemums that I've joined,
Stunning.
and it brings the senses alive. A lot of individuals who are neurodiverse, like myself, are driven strongly by the senses. In fact, hearing is a really strong sense to me, but that's where that becomes a challenge. But the sight and the visual combination of colours and textures is what's really motivational. For that reason, whilst I'm not qualified in garden design, I am trained as a professional gardener. I have, and people have fed back to me on this, a bit more of an intrinsic ability to be able to coordinate garden space. And there's that never-ending reward pathway in the brain, the signal brought about by intrigue of new plants on the market, or the kind of wanting to nurture something that isn't, well, at the end of the day, plants don't answer back to you. They've not got that sort of interpersonal politics and kind of etiquette that we have to deal with as humans. And you've got that wider appreciation of nature from the senses of then combining with the bird song and the sound of little aeroplanes going above in the sky, and you've got the weather patterns and looking out the window and looking at the light. It's all very sensory driven, and for that reason it's fascinating. And then you've got the whole kind of very grounded situation of just literally putting your hands in the soil, which is proven to generate serotonin and good feelings within you as you're gardening. And it actually is restorative back to an understanding that a simple life is actually better. And for me, that couldn't have been further than the truth, because I burnt myself out in my old job. I did so well that everyone, myself included, got complacent, burnt out, and I had a nervous breakdown from it, effectively. Because the anxiety got too much, and because I was overperforming and filling out every last hour with work engagements. There's also a lot of voluntary work as well, which I adored doing and was very capable of. Like you say, award-winning. I was award-winning in that capacity as well, so I was doing something right, but something had to give, and gardening became the kind of sort of eased everything. It eased everything, but I feel more intelligent doing this now than anything I've ever done before.
Yeah, goodness, that's really interesting, Chris. Thank you. And you were talking about that connection with the soil and the impact, the positive impact it's had on you as a neurodiverse person. But I think there's something there for everybody, isn't there, in terms of connecting with plants? And you don't need to have a big garden, do you, Chris? That doesn't, even a window ledge or a window box, right? You can get yourself involved.
Oh, absolutely. At all stages of gardening. And what's really good is, I talked about reward pathways in the brain, is that even with something that's on a momentous scale, we've got Chelsea Flower Show coming up next week, and it'll show the grandest projects going, and your brain is inclined to think, well, how can I practically translate that into space? Well, the answer is you can. There are snippets of that, in the same way that interior design and all other things seem, you can always take flavor, and fashion, of course, clothes fashion, we always are able to mimic aspects of a style, but in a smaller fashion. It triggers these thought processes in the brain that are curious, and yearning for something and looking for the step, and that's motivational, so therefore positive, and then takes you out of a situation that perhaps might be more challenging if you're in that. But it's then also regulatory. So whether you're neurodiverse or not, it's a regulatory process that can ease you through something, or it can be the sort of link between two, with the harmony between two more challenging situations. For example, you could be in amongst work meetings and running around like a headless chicken in between those, and you've got a 5-minute window, and that nip out into the back door, just simply looking at the garden, or tending to that planter, refreshing it, as I was yesterday, refreshing all of our spring pots at the hotel where I work at, from spring display to summer. And I was determined to get them all done yesterday. I mean, that's triggered by the plants themselves to actually want to get those off.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Chris. So I wondered if you could share any challenges that you might have faced in gardening due to being autistic, and whether or not, and how you've overcome them.
I think there are several. I think the ever endearing concept of adapting to change will always be there. And I mean, at the end of the day, autism, there isn't a cure, and I'm content with identifying as autistic. That's not a problem for me. However, I always encounter, in every context, gardening included, having to understand. I'd be very self-aware that change might happen at short notice, and that includes gardening, because, of course, with the weather, plants may not succeed, or they might succeed, but they succeed at the time that you don't want them to. So plants might flower earlier than you think with the adaptation to climate change. And little things like that can be unpredictable, causes situations where you've sort of preconceived an idea and then it doesn't quite work where you are. But then in itself, the fact that gardening provides the ability to mark down quite a good to-do list, and the fact that we're working in nature and we're not dealing with wider emotional, you've got safe space to be in to help regulate from things like that. Other things that might cause some challenges for me at the moment in gardening are obviously overwhelm of too many different tasks all at once, with everything growing at the moment. I mean, that affects all of us, but the key thing for me is making sure that you don't overcommit on things, and you box what you want to achieve now, and then sort of try to strategize a little bit more. I think particularly being in a head gardener position, you're there to curate the space that you're in, and you're a custodian of that. You've got professional judgment to be able to go, well, all of these things are priorities, but this is more of a priority, and that can be left. And it's allowed me to box in with a quite good degree of self-awareness, more than previous capacities where I was very sort of deadline driven, office work, everything had to be done for clients that wanted everything yesterday. I couldn't have that luxury of being able to box in with a professional judgment what could be achieved. Everything had to be achieved. That's probably why it didn't work in the end. But in a natural environment situation, you don't have as much of that, but you've also got, let's say, that sensory appreciation of being outside to just sort of take a step back and sit for a minute. Other things, loud noises, machinery as well, sensory input, noise, vibration. I sometimes struggle with aspects of that, have to make sure I have a few more adaptations or PPE equipment when working with things like that, and maybe not working for as long a period of time as others might well want to with that machinery.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I think throughout the conversation thus far, we've talked quite a lot about the positive impact, haven't we, in terms of on folks' mental health around gardening. And it's really relevant given that it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. And the theme for this year is connection, and connecting with others. So have you found that gardening has helped you connect with others in the community? And obviously you're now head gardener at the hotel, but sort of over the span of your gardening career, have you found that gardening has helped you connect with the community and others?
enormously. I mean, a lot of the things here, the connections, this included, really, is come off the back of the social media account, which is now on Instagram. There's about 14,000 followers on there. I mean, I'm not actively pursuing that. It's come as a natural growth of an appreciation. There's a very strong loyalty of people internationally, and some of whom will set their alarms for you and watch what you're doing when you're going live. And it's about the delivery of information, and people appreciate the kind of way in which I'm giving out that information. Not always about gardening as well. It's all about authentic. It's about real life. It'll cover downs whilst I'm doing the gardening as well. But there's a real harmony in people. I mean, I've been on holiday with people that I've connected with. I've gone and met at shows. I'm speaking. It's all come through that. There is a huge, generous spirit in gardening. I knew that anyway, because I did used to visit gardens. It wasn't I was totally aloof through childhood, teenage years, and early adulthood. I was appreciating a garden to visit in a historic environment sense, but I didn't know what to do with the plants, and often didn't know what the plants were. But I'm very good with my Latin now, and I'm very good with obtaining that information to reuse, and you know, practically I'm better. I could not learn in an exam environment to train myself as a gardener. I had to be a practically driven gardener. And I think for that reason as well, people have connected because they engage with the fact that that there's not, particularly for neurodiverse people, this one-size-fits-all approach of learning actually doesn't necessarily work for us. And so it was a good case example of actually I'd been successful in one career and been able to adapt into another quite well. You know, there's a lot of challenges that still face me, but I've been able to do all that. And then on top of that, relocate to an island, live independently. You know, a lot of things in my repertoire that statistically autistic people do not necessarily achieve. And no, I wouldn't be talking to you on this live session as a teenager because I wouldn't be able to speak properly. I mean, I had a speech therapist till I was 14. You know, I always remind myself of that because it was very, very difficult early on for everybody, myself included. Was involved in trying to understand who I was, really.
Yeah. I think folk like yourself, in terms of using your platforms to educate and inform, can be really positive, because I imagine that for some folk, you know, it feels like, you know, there's not a positive end or there's not a positive outcome, but actually you've been able to demonstrate, you know, really, really well that actually that you are able to overcome some of those barriers and understand them and manage them in a way that creates a really healthy environment for you. And then the fact that you're then sort of creating these platforms to inform and educate others is such a positive story. And talking about positive stories, Chris, I wondered if you could maybe share a memorable story about a project or something that you've done in your gardening career that really stands out to you.
Well, I think we're linked to this is the advocacy work has always been part of my career anyway. I mean, as a town planner, I was supporting a lot of young planners in the profession voluntarily. So I also have as well a number of adversarial roles. I'm an ambassador for various gardening firms, but I work a lot with Greenfingers charity, supporting gardens, builds and spaces for children in hospice care.
Right.
And so one of the most memorable things for me is working on a live garden project that was a makeover that was going to be supporting a new health suite, and it's that reward pathway again. You kind of I always, with everything I'm doing, I always think, well, you know, I've got to a certain stage in my situation where it's still uncomfortable sometimes, but most of the time it isn't. It is comfortable and I'm content with where I am, and I've got to somewhere above, like I say, statistically where I shouldn't be. There are people out there that haven't quite got there yet. So I always feel that I'm in that way. So to have actually presided over the planting of the garden, anything like that, and assisting in a show garden at Chelsea last year, the National Autistic Society's main avenue show garden, was a particular highlight. And the fact that I got through that the team were very accommodating, but it was hard. An autistic person was still having to plant next door to a generator with headphones on, admittedly, but you can imagine what that was like for 10 hours in the hot heat. But you look back at these things and you think, crikey, I did that and I wanted to do it, and what a coup. And it's made me have that inner confidence to think, well, yes, I'll need a heck of a lot of support and I'm a bit nervous, but I'd want to perhaps have a go at doing a show garden myself. And that's the whole thing about this. It's the reward pathway is now, I like to see that in other individuals, as a result of perhaps my actions or my contribution, seeing somebody else starting to flourish and make their own independent decisions through gardening and find their way again, is a joy. And that extends here. I'm trying to do that here on Island as well. We support charities that grow for the hotel on account, that employ adults with various learning disabilities, and I see the joy on their face every single time when they're supplying me with the plants that they've grown, and they can come and see what they've grown in the gardens. It's that tangible link between the start of their clocking on and the plant suddenly coming into flower. There's a long journey there for that person that we can document, and more of that. I love that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's such a sense of achievement, isn't it, Chris, for folk when they plant a tiny little seed and then all of a sudden they have a bloom, or they have this gorgeous plant that they're able to then see in a public space. That sounds so powerful. So how do you think that gardening sort of can be used to raise awareness around autism? Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done with the autistic charities and gardening.
Yeah. So, yes, you indicated previously at headed up a gardening service for Autism East Midlands, and that, again, related to facilitating independent living for individuals. So there were various service users there, ranging from non-verbal right through to similar situations as me. But in every case of the word, it was, finding a situation that met their needs and learning about their support needs first before you met them, and getting built a one-to-one rapport with them through gardening. And that was a lovely piece of nourishment there. I used to like those one-to-one interactions, and see kind of the effects of what we were doing on those individuals' faces. I also support the National Autistic Society, say through the show garden, but then there's the wider premise of speaking at shows. I've just been at Gardeners World Spring Fair back at Gilwood, Hampshire, speaking there on the Saturday, covering about how gardening and almost like a destiny in horticulture really works for individuals like me. Previously, for 8 years, I was a guest lecturer for the National Autistic Society as well on the postgraduate programmes. But that was in the early capacity. The gardening hadn't featured at that point, but effectively it was saying the same thing. It was in the sense of being the role model, really, of through adversity you can get there. And I by and large was mainstream educated. There's nothing I'm concealing here. There's no sort of extra additional support. I had to go through the same rungs of difficulty obtaining support for my needs. Well, I say family did rather than me, and also difficulties of understanding my condition that was a lot more challenging than it is now. It's still very challenging now, but in a very, very different way. And so I'm coming through to explaining what the adult livelihood really is now. But there's always a want to make sure that people adequately understand what it's about.
Thank you, Chris. So talking about getting autistic folk involved, if we might have some viewers who they themselves are neurodiverse, or we might have some viewers who have got family members who are neurodiverse, whether that be children or adults. What advice would you offer to them in terms of getting them interested in nature and planting and gardening? What do you think the first steps could be for folk to take?
I think there's a couple of things. I think that for those who are a little bit more routinely minded, that I was particularly, when younger, not now, much more flexible in the concept of routine. Looking at things that are more list-based, identifying what plants are, and getting an understanding in the language and learning of that into your kind of vocabulary. And of course, we'd love to see more curriculum incorporating gardening. I'm not sure why it still isn't really thought of. It is in some respects, I will give it that. But I think that that identification of plants and colours as well, indirect identified plants. It doesn't necessarily have to be horticultural wording that the person has, but it's an understanding of colour and texture, and then indirectly there's appreciation of plants through that. But then there's other things that aren't gardening. If you're very much an artist, and I see myself as an artist really, and doing the gardens here and curating what is a 5-acre garden over the Channel Islands, it needs a lot of work doing to them. But if you like drawing and painting and so forth, it's an engagement with plants and horticulture and nature through that. You don't, without even needing to step outside, but perhaps looking out of the window and so forth. But actually then also from a social space sort of situation, a lot of gardens are quite well geared up as an environment for neurodiverse individuals, in the sense that not all of them are crowded. They're often got beautiful, pleasant views and vistas from them. There's contributions left, right and centre. There's often a fountain in there. There's sensory planting, fragrance. There's textural plants in there. A lot of the plants are safe, and if they're not, such as the poisonous ones, it can be easily identified. So there's a learning process from that. And there's often silent spaces. In fact, there's a charity that supports silent spaces in garden, geared towards anybody. It doesn't have to be neurodiverse individuals, but anybody who wants a peace and quiet and solace. And the garden has been developed with that in mind, designed purposely to get that kind of sanctuary. So actually finding everybody, I think, who is neurodiverse, I think it would be fair to say that we all would want a safe space to feel that we can gravitate to when we need it. And that's all, I think, where you find the engagement with gardening for a lot of people, is that they identify with the safe space first, and then they analyse actually what's going on within that once they've established that they want to come back to this place. So it's getting to a position of comfort, I think, for them, or indirectly looking at what are the skills that they have, and weaving that into looking at plants. If they're more routine, of course, picking out and looking at what's in the hedgerows for a start would be a good example of identifying plants.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. We've actually got a question from our viewers, and the question is, Chris, do you do any advocacy work in schools, as they think it would be wonderful for kids to hear your story of flourishing despite your school experience?
I have previously, yes, I have, and I have in the planning capacity as well. Say, previous life, I, for many years, worked for the Royal Town Planning Institute as a volunteer, supporting young planners through the profession, and that equally included engaging at the very grassroots level of making sure that our children remembered that this was a really good thing to do once they became, got older in life. It's no different with gardening. There is an increasing movement of engaging schools with gardening, and I know there's quite a few other people equivalent to me that are working very hard on that. Credit to, but I do that, and I think it's very, very important, because I remember what I was going through as a child and didn't have access to that, and so there's a nation to want to make sure we don't end in that trap again. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you make a good point about raising awareness and more access to gardening. And, there's more community gardens, for example. So you might have large, social housing estates that have maybe got some unused green spaces, haven't they? And you've now got communities coming together with families, with children, and planting food, and as well as wildflowers, etc. But so there is across to people relations, and the fact that we are here to be enriched by each other, and be better people from engaging with each other, but you sometimes do that societal link is eased through being in a community-led gardening situation. There's also the whole concept of food sourcing and resilience, and making sure that children understand early on what they can do with food and cooking, with how they can support others, particularly when they become adults and realise they've got to, fund themselves and things are very expensive. It's working out, how to make best use of what you've got. And we lost some of that a little bit, but actually we've come back into that foray a little bit about plant sourcing and heritage, and also our diets have changed. There's a bit more of an understanding of how to be healthy, I think, and it all links into that. If you've not got an awareness of an ingrained understanding and appreciation of gardens and plants, it will affect other aspects of your life. I think I'm fair enough to say something as bold as that, because it is very intrinsically linked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Chris, what do you think some effective strategies or practices that you found helpful in terms of creating an inclusive and supportive environment for individuals with autism? So you've done that, in other spaces. So what do you think those strategies and practices would be to make it inclusive for autistic folk?
Well, I think time and patience is always first and foremost. The kind of understanding that I talked about regulatory benefits of gardening, is making sure that we don't apply a sort of unilateral language and way of doing in gardening to each individual that you work with. Of course, we're all very different, just within autism, let alone individuals neurodiverse. So it's actually got to be person-centered first and foremost, working out how someone is and really reading into any pre-understood needs that they might require first and foremost, and then really engaging with that from the off is vital. And that will then include, in my case and in other cases, it's been things like breaking down gardening tasks into smaller chunks than perhaps you would normally want to do personally. Maybe alternating the gardening tasks like you would do anyway. It's best practice in gardening to alternate your gardening tasks anyway, because, for example, you don't want to be using machinery all day because you might get repetitive strain injury. Now, we can do that quite easily, but breaking it down for people who might need to alternate a bit better so they can be more productive. Sometimes it seems to escape us a little bit more, but actually, yes, breaking that down a little bit more keeps your brain going, makes you happier ultimately, actually more productive, and you get more done in some respects. But secondly, as well, is harnessing wider peripheral things. I mean, I'm quite good as a people person, actually. That's why I've ended up being as a hotel gardener. I see myself in the house. So if I engage with my staff, I'm harnessing my strengths of introducing what I'm doing through the plants. The plants become the icebreaker for me. And I've learned so many anecdotes off others to help me do that. But if you are less social than that, they are some wonderful applied tasks that you can split month by month. Gardening is really good from a sort of planning point of view, where you have to be a bit careful about timing of those tasks, because, like I say, climate change particularly throws a spanner in the works sometimes with things happening. Too dry in the UK at the moment, isn't it? So things are sprouting and flowering too early, and we're not getting enough water, so that has an effect on your preconceived ideas. But you can have a general understanding of typical things that you could do month by month. That's quite common for all gardeners, but I think that works particularly well for neurodiverse individuals to have a guide sheet to come back to in the event that they feel that they're at an impasse. And secondly, I think also bringing to life, if you're not particularly sociable, bringing to life the amount of contribution that you've made through something else that individual is good at, such as writing something, so they could then write out and have ownership over an area of the garden, or writing what particular plants are doing well at the moment, and they've had ownership of identifying, walking around the garden, looking after those plants, and identifying with that to the audience. If it's a public garden, great, because then visitors get the benefit of seeing that, and it's kind of their project to be able to do. From a personal point of view, it could be something that could be diarised. In my case, of course, I documented it a lot on social media and was documenting the journey of the garden and things that were coming up and why. So it worked well for me. But it could be just something you do as a hobby to yourself to upgrade your sense of being a social confident. It doesn't have to be broadcast to lots of people. I just happen to choose to. It suits for me.
Yeah. And I think that the way that you've articulated that around identifying what an individual's strengths are, and the joy of gardening is there's multiple tasks, isn't there? And there's multiple projects. And so there's something there for everybody, isn't it? Regardless of what their strengths are or what their perhaps struggles and challenges are, there's definitely something within that gardening journey, if you like, or cycle for an autistic person to be able to thrive and enjoy.
There are more opportunities. Because it's a lot freer. I mean, I know that, I'm still in the professional industry. I still, have to work to a certain standard. Of course I do. But the conversation is a lot freer. You can be yourself a lot more in horticulture. And if that being yourself was to be, unlike me, a little perhaps. I mean, I am still shy. I'm an extroverted introvert is what I identify. So I will do all these things, but I still have to then identify that after a while, I have to zone out and do very little. Yeah. I still have that situation that somebody who is fully introverted would go through. It's just there's a delayed onset with me. In many contexts, many professions, you haven't got the luxury of being able to retreat for that moment. In gardening, whether your garden is tiny and it's a balcony, or whether it's a 5-acre garden like I'm working in, there is somewhere that you can retreat to as yourself, and you are not competing with many different other interests other than nature itself, which will not judge you by and large. And I think that is really, really important, because we are still living, as much as we are more inclusive in many respects now, and thank goodness for that, we are still having to regulate ourselves in a world that isn't necessarily meant for us. And I think it's a really, it might not always be the best paid profession. There's always been a struggle with that with horticulture. However, the variety within it is absolutely staggering. You don't all end up having to become gardeners. You could be working in horticulture, but you could be designing an exhibition stand for flower shows, or you could be a parking attendant in a garden, but you happen to be working within the garden environment. It could be a cafe. It doesn't have to be strictly that, but you've got an indirect link with nature in that respect. You could be a ranger. You could be working as a groundskeeper and not be doing anything with gardening, but you're still out there in the outdoors, and all of those things will harness there. And generally, you're around like-minded people that are generous spirited by and large, that are appreciating that. If you're going and working in nature, you generally, hopefully, amongst other people that are appreciative of that, and will. I hope it will trickle down to being a little bit more inclusive with yourself, because as you. Because you're there and you're suddenly not different as much. I think that's really important. Surround yourselves with those who understand you.
Yeah, no, that's very, very good advice, Chris. We have another question from our community this morning. So, hi, Chris. It's been lovely listening to you speaking this morning. Are there any particular... there we go. Are there any particular gardening tasks you find especially calming or rewarding?
Oh, yes. Well, I will say weeding, because it's always there, but you're there and you're just zoning down and you're looking at the... I mean, last night, this isn't meant to sound pretentious at all, I was weeding around the swimming pool at the hotel. So you're looking in the cracks of the pavement. It actually took me back to my childhood, slightly uncomfortably for a minute, because when I was in primary school, I often got sent to the head teacher's office for this sort of unruly behaviour that I was having, and I basically was struggling and melting down, I suppose. And I would often stare into the cracks in the bricks in the wall, thinking there were little towns and cities in there, because I was obsessed with towns and cities and maps at the time, as I hinted earlier. And it reminded me of that moment, because I was looking into these cracks with the weeding. It just brought me back a flashback to that, although it wasn't an uncomfortable one, thankfully. But it's that zone of real attention to detail. So I love that. I love the fact that I go around the garden and looking at the textures of plants. Deadheading, some people don't like doing that. I love deadheading. I also love things like lawn edging, you know, getting a neat boundary on things. And I'm certainly quite a naturalistic gardener, so that doesn't necessarily extend to things like making lawns tidy. I leave things a bit longer these days, particularly for wildlife reasons. Yeah, I'm quite like that sort of neatness in that respect. And then finally, I absolutely adore doing little designs of borders and concept. You know, I'm not necessarily trained to garden design, but I love it. Brings back that childhood skill, I think, of used to like drawing. It's actually brought that back for me.
So our viewer said, I agree. Weeding is hard work, but also satisfying afterwards. So there's definitely another person there who relates to that weeding story.
Absolutely.
I've got another question. So we have an active group this morning. So the next question is, Chris, do you find the autistic label helps or hinders your life experience? And does it actually affect how other people interact with you?
I think by and large, I've always attempted to be open about my condition from the off. There was a period in young teenage life where I was fearful of it. I'm not fearful of it now. I will always try. So, for example, I do choose to declare my disability on application forms and so forth. Working in an open public environment on social media, I've always been public about it. And I have a media pack whenever a company comes and approaches me for work, because I work freelance, both in the UK and here in the Channel Islands. You know, it says in there, it says in the media pack, I'm autistic. There's no hiding it, and I choose that with valid reason that that there has to be a baseline of right, okay, to the recipient. If they take a step back and go, as particularly, oh, you know, he's one of those, well, that's their problem. But at the end of the day, in the vast majority of situations, we work in an environment where I think, okay, right, we might have to tailor our situation a little differently for Chris. Know a little bit more and see where it goes, because that's or we'll read up about what we already know about it, what's been given to us about it, and we'll work, you know, within the law to support him. And I think at the end of the day, there's then also gives rise that, hang on a minute, we might actually have a genius here. You know, we forget about this. That I know it's quite concerning, and sometimes we do work environments and live in environments where, when you declare yourself as autistic, it can still, unfortunately, be met with a difficult reception. Not always, the vast majority of times it isn't like that. But you know, why can't there be a situation where you just declare from the off and think, well, actually, we might have a real good asset here? You know, in many cases, there will be people that will be thinking like that. They might not immediately notice that, but they might think, well, hang on a minute. And I want to sort of embrace that thought process really a little bit. At the end of the day, it'll get found out one day or another. I think somebody who's a little bit have been through some unpleasant experiences with identifying as autistic in the past. It's about finding that safe, confident and safe environment in which to be able to disclose, and easing in at different paths as well, until you feel that you're point at which you're fully comfortable. I was at that stage earlier in life, so it's not been a case of black and white, from going non-disclosure to full disclosure. It's taken finding people who I want to be around, and they're not necessarily friends. They're a person of authority, perhaps, and a person of confidence. that really works well. I don't think it's I think it's more of an asset than a hindrance. I think where it's a hindrance is something I'm very, very self-aware of now, in the sense of feeling an intense anxiety at times, and I have to then come down from that and lessen the to-do list and rein things in and ultimately say no. And in the previous life, I wasn't saying no to things enough, and that was something I had to adapt to. Realise that I can't do that anymore because I am the way I am wired up, and there's no harm in saying no sometimes, or going, I can do this, but it's going to have to be, these circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really helpful sort of reflection, Chris, because it's the work of others to do, not you. It's about raising our awareness. It's about understanding, what autism really is. And it's also about being interested and being curious about what works for each and every one of us, and I think that you're doing a fantastic job. I'm just actually going to wind up now because I can't believe that we've run out of time. But, I think that thank you so much for joining us today. And I think it's so important for folk like yourself to use your platforms for good, for raising awareness. And it's been an absolute pleasure to hear about your journey today and to hear about your love and your passion for gardening, and also the commitment that you've got to raising awareness and creating positive spaces for autistic people. So it's been an absolute pleasure. My last question to you is, how can people find out a bit more about you, and how can they get in touch?
So yes, predominantly on Instagram, it's Groovy Gardening UK. My website is chrisjesson.com as well, which has everything you need to know. And I'm also, on Facebook, Groovy Gardening with Chris. But you can also follow, I work for the Pommier Hotel over in Guernsey as the head gardener. So you'll also see me on their media channels. Come and visit the Channel Islands and see what the gardening's about here.
Yeah, well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today, Chris. And that's a goodbye from me. I'm Caroline Gillwood, Head of EDI here at Royal Voluntary Service, and it's been an absolute pleasure. You take care, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.